Your surgical technique is adequate but lacks the refinement our clients expect, Sarah. They're trusting us with beloved family members, my business partner said, dismissing my approach in front of a client whose dog needed emergency surgery. The worried pet owner looked uncertain, questioning whether to proceed. My partner, Dr. Robert Chen, smiled reassuringly and gestured toward the surgical suite. Let me handle this procedure. I've performed this operation hundreds of times with excellent outcomes. I stood in the Seattle Veterinary Hospital exam room, watching Robert position himself as the experienced surgeon despite the fact that I'd developed our clinic's entire surgical program from nothing. The innovative minimally invasive technique we used was mine, developed through years of specialized training and refinement. The post-operative care protocols that gave us superior recovery outcomes were mine, created through careful observation and systematic improvement. The client relationships built on trust and excellent medical outcomes were mine, established through countless late nights providing emergency care and compassionate communication with worried pet owners. This was the 23rd time in 2 years that Robert had stolen credit for my veterinary work and positioned himself as the principal veterinarian despite contributing almost nothing to actual patient care or practice development. I'd documented every instance meticulously, building comprehensive evidence of his systematic fraud. I'd gathered proof through medical records showing me as the attending veterinarian, client testimonials praising my care specifically, staff testimony confirming I performed all complex procedures, and financial records proving I'd invested far more capital into building the practice. Because what neither Robert nor this worried dog owner standing in our exam room knew was that I'd already secured legal documentation proving I was the actual majority owner and founder of Mitchell Chen Veterinary Hospital. I'd obtained signed statements from 15 clients willing to testify about Robert's misrepresentation of his role. I'd been approached by 2 established veterinary groups about acquiring my practice or hiring me as their chief surgeon. I'd also consulted extensively with business attorneys who confirmed that Robert had systematically violated our partnership agreement and fraudulently claimed ownership stake he'd never actually earned. In exactly 48 hours, I would dissolve our veterinary practice partnership through legal action and reveal publicly that Robert had been lying about his ownership role, his surgical capabilities, and his contribution to the practice's success. His reputation would collapse when clients learned he'd been taking credit for my work while I saved their pets' lives. My practice would continue successfully under sole ownership with the clients and staff who valued my actual veterinary expertise. Before we witness how a talented veterinary surgeon whose practice was stolen used legal documentation and client loyalty to destroy her fraudulent partner while keeping the hospital she'd built, I want to thank you for being part of this community. A community that believes business fraud deserves serious consequences. A community that understands stolen credit in any profession should be exposed and punished. If you've had your business stolen by partners, if you've watched colleagues claim ownership of what you built, if you've been the invisible force behind someone else's success while they collected profits and recognition that belonged to you, this story will resonate deeply. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories where documentation and determination overcome exploitation. Now let's step into the world of veterinary medicine where a brilliant surgeon's practice was systematically stolen by her charismatic business partner. Where professional hierarchies enabled ongoing fraud. Where 2 years of careful preparation created the foundation for complete exposure and justice. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a 33-year-old veterinary surgeon originally from Portland, Oregon. I grew up in a family where animals were valued as deeply as any human family member, and compassionate care for vulnerable creatures was considered a fundamental moral obligation, not just professional responsibility. My father, David, was a large animal veterinarian who worked primarily with horses, cattle, and other livestock on farms and ranches throughout the Willamette Valley and surrounding rural areas of Oregon. My mother, Jennifer, was a wildlife rehabilitation specialist who ran a small nonprofit organization caring for injured wild animals, from raptors with broken wings to deer hit by cars to countless smaller creatures that most people would overlook. I was surrounded from earliest childhood by discussions about animal health, ethical treatment of all living creatures, and the profound responsibility veterinarians had to provide excellent care regardless of economic circumstances or whether treatment would be financially profitable. Our dinner table conversations often involved complex medical cases my parents were managing, debates about treatment approaches, and philosophical discussions about animal welfare and veterinary ethics. I learned about veterinary medicine practically and intimately when I was 12 years old, beginning to accompany my father on farm calls throughout rural Oregon several times weekly. He taught me systematically about animal anatomy across different species, disease diagnosis through careful physical examination and history-taking, treatment approaches that balanced medical effectiveness with practical farm management realities, and critically important communication skills for working with animal owners who were often frightened, upset, or facing difficult economic decisions about expensive treatments. My father emphasized repeatedly that veterinary medicine required both exceptional technical excellence and genuine compassion, explaining that you were never treating just the animal patient in isolation but always treating the complex relationship between that animal and the human family members who loved them. He demonstrated this principle constantly, spending extra time explaining conditions to worried owners, adjusting treatment plans to accommodate limited budgets, and following up personally on cases to ensure recovery was progressing. He taught me to observe animals carefully, noticing subtle signs of pain or distress that indicated problems. He'd point out how a horse holding weight differently on one leg suggested early lameness, how a cow's decreased rumination indicated digestive issues, how changes in an animal's normal behavior patterns often signaled illness before obvious physical symptoms appeared. These observational skills became foundational to my diagnostic approach. My father also emphasized that veterinary integrity meant always putting animal welfare above personal profit or convenience, even when that created financial or professional challenges. He'd show me examples from his practice and from cases he heard about in the veterinary community where veterinarians had recommended unnecessary procedures purely for financial gain, or failed to provide adequate care to less profitable patients, or cut corners on treatment quality to maximize efficiency. He made clear these practices violated fundamental professional ethics. He taught me that ethical veterinary practice meant always recommending what was truly best for the animal based on sound medical judgment, even when that meant less revenue because you recommended conservative management instead of expensive surgery, or more personal effort because you needed to provide intensive care for a patient whose owner couldn't afford hospitalization, or difficult conversations where you had to recommend euthanasia when treatment would only prolong suffering. I remember one specific incident when I was 15 that crystallized these lessons about professional integrity and ethical practice in ways that shaped my entire approach to veterinary medicine. A local farmer brought in a valuable breeding mare with a severe leg injury sustained in a fencing accident. The wound was deep, involving significant soft tissue damage and possible fracture. The farmer asked my father directly whether the horse could be saved or should be euthanized immediately to prevent suffering and cut losses. The treatment decision was genuinely complex. Successful treatment would require surgery to repair the wound, extensive post-operative care including daily wound management and bandage changes, stall rest for weeks during healing, possible complications from infection or laminitis in the opposite leg from weight-bearing changes, and no guarantee of successful outcome even with optimal care. The costs would be substantial, running into thousands of dollars. The farmer, who managed a small operation with limited financial resources, needed honest assessment to make an informed decision. My father spent hours that afternoon carefully examining the mare, taking radiographs to assess bone involvement, evaluating blood flow and tissue viability, discussing with the farmer exactly what surgery would involve, what the recovery process would require in terms of time and resources, and honestly assessing the realistic chances of successful return to soundness for breeding purposes. He was meticulous and transparent about both the possibilities and risks. He told the farmer that based on his examination, he believed the mare could recover with aggressive treatment and careful management, But he wouldn't guarantee the outcome given the severity of injury and inherent complications of equine orthopedic healing. He quoted a fair price for the surgery and aftercare based on actual costs and reasonable compensation, not inflated pricing that exploited the farmer's emotional attachment to a valuable animal. The farmer, who had genuinely limited resources and multiple financial pressures on his farm operation, asked if there were cheaper options that might still give the mare a chance. He was trying to balance his care for the animal with harsh economic realities. My father thought carefully, then reduced his fee significantly from what he'd initially quoted, explaining honestly that he wanted to try saving the mare because he believed it was medically possible and the right thing to do for the animal, not because it was financially optimal for his practice. The surgery was performed the next day and proved as complex as expected, requiring several hours of careful work. I assisted my father, learning an enormous amount about surgical technique and post-operative management. The recovery was long and demanding, requiring daily care and multiple follow-up visits over weeks. But the mare healed successfully, eventually returning to full soundness and producing several healthy foals in subsequent years. The farmer told everyone in the rural community about my father's skill, integrity, and willingness to adjust pricing to save an animal when a reasonable chance existed. The story brought my father referrals from throughout the region for years afterward, as people sought out a veterinarian they could trust to be honest and fair. That experience taught me viscerally that ethical practice built lasting reputation and deep trust with clients, that financial success came as a result of excellent medicine and integrity, not from maximizing every transaction. My mother contributed the critical complementary perspective about treating all animals with dignity and working to minimize suffering regardless of economic value or practical utility. As a wildlife rehabilitator, she worked primarily with creatures that had no monetary worth, couldn't be sold, generated no profit, and often required intensive care for weeks or months. She treated them simply because they were living beings that deserved care and had capacity for suffering that should be relieved when possible. She taught me extensively about pain management across different species, stress reduction techniques to help injured animals heal more effectively, and creating care environments where frightened or traumatized creatures could feel safe enough to allow healing. She demonstrated daily that good medicine meant considering the animal's emotional and psychological state as seriously as physical symptoms, that quality of life mattered as much as simple survival, and that sometimes the most compassionate care meant recognizing when an animal couldn't be saved and providing peaceful euthanasia to prevent prolonged suffering. I watched my mother care for countless wild animals, from raptors with wing injuries that required months of physical therapy to regain flight capability, to baby raccoons orphaned when their mother was killed, to deer with various injuries requiring careful treatment and gradual return to wild conditions. She worked tirelessly, often at significant personal financial cost, simply because she believed these creatures deserved care. Her example taught me that veterinary medicine at its best served animals themselves, not just human economic interests. I earned admission to Washington State University's College of Veterinary Medicine after completing undergraduate studies in biology with exceptionally high grades and extensive volunteer experience in veterinary clinics and wildlife rehabilitation. Washington State's veterinary program was one of the most competitive in the country, accepting only about 10% of applicants. The program was brutally demanding intellectually and practically, requiring mastery of anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, surgery, internal medicine, and countless other subjects across all major animal species from cats and dogs to horses, cattle, pigs, and exotic pets. Veterinary school was genuinely grueling in ways that exceeded any previous academic experience. We learned anatomy through extensive dissections of multiple species, memorizing thousands of anatomical structures and understanding how they varied across different animals. We studied pharmacology, learning drug mechanisms, proper dosing calculations across vastly different body sizes, and species-specific contraindications where medications safe for one animal were toxic to another. We learned diagnostic techniques from physical examination through advanced imaging. We practiced surgical skills on models and eventually supervised procedures on actual patients. The training was demanding but absolutely essential for the complexity and life or death responsibility of independent veterinary practice. Unlike human medicine, where doctors specialize in single organ systems or specific procedures, veterinarians need comprehensive knowledge across multiple species with vastly different anatomy and physiology. We needed to diagnose and treat everything from routine infections to complex surgeries to emergency trauma, often with limited diagnostic equipment compared to human hospitals and always with patients who couldn't verbally communicate symptoms. My clinical rotations during third and fourth year of veterinary school included extensive surgical training where I discovered I had natural talent for surgical work. I possessed steady hands with fine motor control essential for delicate procedures, spatial reasoning skills that helped me visualize complex three-dimensional anatomy and plan surgical approaches, and the calm temperament and focus needed to handle high-pressure emergency procedures where animals' lives depended on quick, accurate decisions. My surgical rotation mentors, experienced veterinary surgeons who supervised our training, encouraged me strongly to pursue advanced surgical specialization after graduation. They said I demonstrated potential for genuine excellence in veterinary surgery, noting my technical skills, decision-making under pressure, and commitment to thorough post-operative monitoring and care. Their encouragement influenced my decision to apply for competitive surgical residency positions after earning my DVM degree. After graduating from veterinary school at age 26, I completed a highly competitive one-year rotating internship at a large veterinary specialty hospital in Denver, gaining intensive experience across multiple medical specialties including internal medicine, oncology, neurology, and especially surgery and emergency medicine. The internship year was brutally demanding, involving 80 to 100-hour work weeks, overnight emergency duty, and exposure to the most complex and challenging cases that general practitioners referred when they needed specialty expertise. Following the internship, I was accepted into a prestigious 3-year surgical residency program at a renowned veterinary specialty hospital in Seattle. Surgical residencies in veterinary medicine are extremely competitive, accepting only a handful of candidates nationally each year from hundreds of applicants. The residency provided intensive training in advanced surgical techniques and approaches, exposing me to complex procedures that most general practice veterinarians would never encounter or attempt. During residency, I learned minimally invasive surgical approaches including laparoscopy and arthroscopy that reduced surgical trauma to patients, accelerated recovery times, and decreased postoperative pain and complications compared to traditional open surgery. I studied cutting-edge pain management protocols using multimodal approaches combining different drug classes and techniques to provide superior pain relief. I developed deep expertise in orthopedic surgery for bone and joint problems, soft tissue surgery for abdominal and thoracic procedures, and emergency trauma care for severely injured animals. The residency training was comprehensive and demanding. I performed hundreds of surgeries under supervision, gradually advancing from assisting to performing procedures independently. I learned to handle surgical complications when they occurred, developing problem-solving skills and clinical judgment necessary for independent practice. I studied surgical literature extensively, understanding evidence basis for different techniques and approaches. I presented cases at weekly rounds, defending my decisions and learning from critique by experienced surgeons. During my second year of surgical residency, I developed an innovative surgical technique for treating cranial cruciate ligament injuries in dogs, one of the most common and problematic orthopedic conditions in veterinary medicine. The cranial cruciate ligament in dogs' knees is analogous to the anterior cruciate ligament in human knees, and rupture causes severe lameness, pain, and progressive arthritis. The condition is extremely common, affecting hundreds of thousands of dogs annually. Traditional surgical repair methods had significant limitations. Some techniques had high complication rates with implant failures. Others required extensive recovery periods with restricted activity for months. Many resulted in ongoing lameness and arthritis despite surgery. I studied the existing literature extensively, identifying consistent problems with conventional approaches and thinking about how surgical technique might be modified to address those limitations. I designed a modified surgical approach that altered implant placement angles and positions based on detailed biomechanical analysis of forces in the canine knee joint. My technique used different tissue handling that preserved more of the natural joint structures. The approach achieved better postoperative stability while causing less surgical trauma and requiring less extensive dissection. I tested the technique carefully on cadaver specimens first, refining the approach through multiple iterations. Once I was confident the technique was sound, I began using it on clinical cases under close supervision from my residency mentors. The initial results were promising, with dogs achieving excellent stability and returning to normal activity more quickly than with conventional techniques. I carefully documented outcomes, following patients long-term to assess durability of repairs. The results continued to be excellent over time. I published the technique in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medical Association with detailed surgical description, biomechanical rationale, and outcome data from my first 50 cases. The publication received significant attention in the veterinary surgical community. Surgeons at other institutions began adopting the technique, reporting similarly positive results. Several surgical residency programs incorporated my approach into their training curriculum. The innovation established my reputation early in my career as a thoughtful, creative surgeon who could advance the field beyond simply replicating existing techniques. After completing my residency at 30 years old, I had strong surgical skills, specialized training, and excellent professional reputation. Multiple veterinary hospitals offered me positions as a staff surgeon with good salaries. But I wanted to build my own practice where I could implement my surgical innovations, establish client relationships directly, and practice medicine according to my values without corporate constraints. Starting an independent veterinary practice required substantial capital for facility, equipment, and initial operating expenses. I had strong medical skills but limited business experience and no existing client base in Seattle where I wanted to establish the practice. I needed a business partner who could handle operations while I focused on building the medical program. I met Dr. Robert Chen at a veterinary conference in San Francisco. He was 41, charismatic, with an MBA and claimed 15 years of veterinary practice management experience. He approached me after my presentation on surgical innovations, saying he'd been looking for a talented surgeon partner to build a specialty veterinary hospital in Seattle. Over several meetings, Robert outlined his vision for a high-end veterinary hospital providing advanced surgical care and emergency services. He said he had business expertise, industry connections, and capital to invest in the facility. He'd handle all business operations, client development, and practice management while I'd focus entirely on surgery and medical program development. The division seemed perfect. We formed Mitchell Chen Veterinary Hospital as a partnership. The operating agreement specified we were 50-50 partners with equal ownership. Robert would contribute initial capital and handle business operations. I would contribute my surgical expertise and build the medical program. We'd split profits equally. Robert handled finding and building out the facility, a beautiful space in an affluent Seattle neighborhood. He oversaw construction of surgical suites, created comfortable client waiting areas, hired administrative staff. He designed our branding and marketing. The facility was genuinely impressive, conveying the professional excellence we wanted to project. The early months were productive and exciting. I established our surgical program, acquired advanced equipment, developed protocols for different procedures, and trained our veterinary technician staff. I worked long hours building our patient care capabilities while Robert supposedly handled business development and operations management. I began treating patients, performing surgeries, providing emergency care. Word spread quickly about my surgical skills and compassionate approach. Clients referred friends and family members. Our reputation grew based on excellent medical outcomes and personal attention I provided to worried pet owners. The practice started thriving based on my clinical work. But I noticed concerning patterns emerging. Robert would greet clients in the lobby, introducing himself as the hospital's founder and principal veterinarian despite performing almost no actual patient care. He'd attend consultations where I'd examine animals and recommend treatment, then position himself as making the final medical decisions even though he contributed nothing substantive. He'd describe surgical procedures I'd performed as our surgical approach, without clarifying that I'd done all the actual work. At first, I told myself this was normal partnership dynamics, that Robert's business role justified sharing credit for the hospital's success. But the pattern escalated. Robert started telling clients he'd performed surgeries I'd done. He'd claim credit for surgical innovations I'd developed. He'd present himself as the experienced surgeon when meeting new clients, relegating me to supporting role despite being the only one who actually operated. The first undeniable instance of fraud involved a complex spinal surgery on a dog that had been paralyzed by a herniated disc. The surgery was technically demanding, requiring precise decompression of spinal nerves without causing additional trauma. I spent 5 hours in surgery carefully removing the damaged disc material and stabilizing the spine. The dog recovered fully, regaining complete mobility within weeks. It was a technically excellent outcome. When the grateful owner picked up their dog after recovery, Robert met with them personally. I overheard him describing the surgery I performed, and my surgical technique, that had saved the dog. The owner thanked Robert profusely for his skill and compassion. Robert accepted the praise without mentioning that I'd performed the entire procedure while he hadn't even observed. The client left believing Robert was the surgeon who'd saved their beloved pet. I confronted Robert immediately about the misrepresentation. He looked confused, saying clients appreciated having the hospital owner personally involved in their cases, that had built confidence and loyalty. He said distinguishing between which partner performed specific procedures was unnecessarily complicated for clients. He suggested I was being territorial about individual credit when we were partners building the practice together. The gaslighting made me question my perception. Maybe I was being unreasonable about wanting accurate credit attribution? But I consulted with my former residency mentor, Dr. Lisa Wong. She listened carefully and said firmly that claiming to have performed surgery you didn't do was professional fraud. She advised documenting everything and protecting myself legally. I began systematically documenting my work through detailed medical records specifying me as the attending veterinarian and surgeon for every procedure. I photographed surgical cases. I saved client communications showing I was providing the medical care. I gathered evidence of Robert's false claims. Over the next 2 years, Robert's systematic fraud and credit theft escalated dramatically in both scope and boldness. He consistently presented himself as the hospital's principal surgeon and medical leader to new clients despite performing almost no actual surgical procedures or hands-on patient care. He claimed ownership credit for the practice's clinical success and growing reputation despite the fact that my medical work, surgical skills, and client relationships were the actual foundation of everything we'd built. He made major business decisions unilaterally without consulting me despite our partnership agreement explicitly requiring joint approval for significant matters. He took larger profit distributions than we'd agreed upon, claiming his business contributions and capital investment justified disproportionate compensation. The pattern of credit theft became systematic and shameless. Every new client who came through our doors would first meet Robert in the beautifully appointed reception area he'd designed. He'd greet them warmly, introduce himself as Dr. Robert Chen, the hospital founder and principal veterinarian, and begin building rapport while I was actually in the back performing surgery or examining other patients. By the time I met these clients for actual medical consultations, Robert had already positioned himself as the senior authority and decision-maker. During consultations where I'd examine animals, take detailed medical histories, perform diagnostic tests, and recommend treatment plans based on my clinical judgment and surgical expertise, Robert would often insert himself into the conversation. He'd position his comments as the final medical decision even though he contributed nothing substantive beyond repeating what I'd already explained or adding vague generalities that sounded authoritative but lacked specific medical content. Clients naturally assumed the dynamic reflected actual medical hierarchy, with Robert as the experienced senior veterinarian supervising my work despite the reality being exactly opposite. I was the board-certified surgeon with specialized training while Robert performed minimal clinical work beyond routine wellness exams for established clients who specifically requested him. The credit theft around surgical procedures became particularly egregious and painful. I'd spend hours performing complex, delicate surgeries that required every bit of my training and skill, procedures that could mean the difference between an animal recovering fully or facing permanent disability or even euthanasia. After these surgeries, when grateful owners picked up their beloved pets after successful recovery, Robert would often meet with them personally in his office. I overheard these conversations repeatedly through our office's thin walls. Robert would describe the surgery I performed, and my surgical technique, that had saved their pet, accepting their tearful gratitude and praise without ever mentioning that I'd performed the entire procedure while he'd been in his office handling administrative tasks or hadn't even been in the building. Clients would leave believing Robert was the skilled surgeon who'd saved their dog's or cat's life, never knowing the truth. One particularly painful incident involved a golden retriever named Cooper who'd been hit by a car and suffered severe injuries including a shattered pelvis, ruptured bladder, and multiple fractures. The owners, a young couple with 2 small children, were devastated and terrified they'd lose their beloved family dog. They'd rushed Cooper to our emergency service late on a Friday night. I spent nearly 6 hours in surgery that night, carefully reconstructing Cooper's shattered pelvis with plates and screws, repairing the bladder rupture, stabilizing the other fractures, and managing the significant blood loss and shock from the trauma. It was technically demanding surgery requiring every bit of my orthopedic training and surgical skill. Cooper's survival wasn't guaranteed, but I gave him every possible chance through meticulous surgical technique and intensive post-operative critical care that I personally provided throughout the weekend. Cooper survived and recovered remarkably well, eventually returning to completely normal activity. When the family picked him up 2 weeks later after his hospital stay, they were overjoyed and immensely grateful. Robert met with them in his office for the discharge appointment. I happened to walk past his office on my way to see another patient and heard him describing in detail the surgery I performed that night, and my decision to use the specific surgical approach that had saved Cooper's life. The family thanked Robert profusely, telling him emotionally that he'd saved their beloved family member and they'd be forever grateful for his skill and dedication. Robert accepted their thanks graciously, even mentioning sacrificing his Friday evening to perform the emergency surgery, when in reality he hadn't even come to the hospital that night. The entire surgery and all subsequent care had been my work alone. I felt absolutely sick listening to this exchange. That surgery had been one of the most challenging and rewarding cases of my career. I'd poured everything I had into saving Cooper's life, working late into the night with intense focus and drawing on all my surgical training and experience. And Robert was claiming it as his own work, stealing both credit and the client's gratitude that should have been mine. When I confronted Robert afterward about the blatant lie, he looked annoyed rather than ashamed. He said clients appreciated having the hospital owner personally involved in their cases, that it built confidence and loyalty to the practice. He claimed that distinguishing between which specific veterinarian performed individual procedures was unnecessarily complicated for clients and potentially confusing. He suggested I was being territorial about individual credit when we were partners building the hospital together and should share collective credit for all successes. The gaslighting and manipulation in his response was sophisticated and effective. He'd taken my entirely reasonable objection to his fraudulent misrepresentation and reframed it as me being petty, territorial, and not understanding how successful partnerships functioned. He made me question whether I was being unreasonable, whether my discomfort with his credit theft was somehow a professional failing on my part. But something felt fundamentally wrong about claiming to have performed surgery you didn't do, about accepting gratitude meant for someone else's work, about systematically lying to clients about who was actually providing their veterinary care. I consulted with my former residency mentor, Dr. Lisa Wong, who'd supervised my surgical training and had decades of experience in veterinary practice. I explained the situation in detail during a phone call, describing Robert's pattern of claiming credit for surgical procedures I'd performed and positioning himself as the principal surgeon despite minimal actual clinical involvement. Dr. Wong listened carefully without interrupting, then delivered a firm and unequivocal assessment. She said that claiming to have personally performed surgery you didn't actually do constituted serious professional fraud and ethical violation that could warrant disciplinary action by state veterinary boards. She explained that surgical competence and proper attribution weren't just matters of professional ego but had real implications for patient safety and informed consent. Clients had the right to know which veterinarian would be performing procedures on their animals, to make decisions based on accurate information about experience and qualifications. Robert's misrepresentation violated clients' ability to make informed choices about their pet's medical care. Dr. Wong advised me strongly to begin systematically documenting everything, to protect myself legally and professionally from Robert's fraud. She suggested maintaining meticulous medical records that clearly specified me as the attending veterinarian and surgeon for every procedure I performed. She recommended photographing surgical cases to create visual evidence of my work. She suggested saving all client communications that showed I was providing the direct medical care. She was concerned enough about the situation to offer to testify on my behalf if legal action became necessary. Her validation that my concerns were legitimate and serious, not petty or territorial, was important psychologically. It helped me trust my own perceptions and understand that Robert's gaslighting was manipulation designed to enable continued exploitation. I began implementing her documentation recommendations immediately and systematically. I created detailed medical records for every patient I treated, ensuring my name appeared clearly as the attending veterinarian and surgeon. For surgical cases, I documented not just the procedure performed but the specific surgical approach used, any complications encountered and how I handled them, post-operative care protocols I implemented, and follow-up care I provided. I photographed surgical patients before and after procedures, creating visual evidence of my clinical work. I saved email and text communications with clients where I discussed their pet's care, creating a paper trail showing I was their actual veterinarian. One particularly egregious incident that I documented carefully involved a local news station doing a feature story about our veterinary hospital for a segment on Seattle's best specialty veterinary practices. The reporter contacted our practice after seeing positive online reviews and hearing recommendations from other local veterinarians. Robert immediately took control of coordinating the news coverage, positioning it as a major marketing opportunity for the hospital. When the reporter and camera crew arrived to film the segment, Robert gave them a tour of the facility, discussing the surgical program I've developed and my commitment to advancing veterinary surgery through innovative techniques and continuing education. He showed them the surgical suites I'd designed and equipped. He discussed minimally invasive surgical approaches I'd brought to the practice. He referenced my published research and surgical innovations as examples of our hospital's contributions to advancing veterinary medicine. The news segment that aired several days later featured Robert prominently, with the reporter describing him as Dr. Robert Chen, a veterinary surgeon pioneering new approaches to pet care in Seattle. Robert was interviewed at length about his surgical philosophy, his medical background, and his vision for the hospital's future. I appeared only briefly in background shots, with no interview and my role never clarified. Viewers would naturally assume Robert was the hospital's principal surgeon based on how the segment was framed and edited. I watched the broadcast feeling devastated and professionally violated. My surgical innovations, my techniques, my years of specialized training and development, my clinical work that had built the hospital's reputation, All of it was being publicly credited to Robert, with millions of local viewers seeing this fraudulent representation. The professional impact was serious. Colleagues from veterinary school and residency saw the segment and messaged me with confused, carefully worded questions, knowing I was the trained surgeon but hearing Robert presented as the innovative surgical leader. Several people asked directly whether I'd actually been involved in developing the techniques Robert discussed, or if he'd hired me after establishing the program himself. The questions revealed that Robert's fraud was successfully reshaping professional perceptions about who had actually built our surgical program. I was becoming invisible in my own career, the ghost behind Robert's stolen reputation. Another incident involved a pharmaceutical company representative visiting to discuss carrying a new pain medication. Robert met with the rep, describing our surgical volume and my experience with post-operative pain management to negotiate better pricing. The representative naturally assumed Robert was the practicing surgeon based on his claims. Robert secured favorable pricing by fraudulently representing his medical activity level. When I confronted Robert about these incidents, he became defensive and aggressive. He said I didn't understand business, that his role as practice manager and majority capital contributor gave him authority to represent the hospital as he saw fit. He claimed I should be grateful for the opportunity he'd provided by partnering with me when I had no business experience. I was shocked by the claim about majority capital contribution. I reviewed our partnership agreement and financial records. They showed I'd actually contributed more capital than Robert, contrary to his claims. He'd leveraged my initial contributions plus the practice's revenues to create the facility, but he hadn't personally invested the amounts he claimed. The financial fraud compounded the credit theft. I also discovered Robert had been systematically undermining my authority with staff. He'd tell veterinary technicians to defer to his judgment on medical decisions despite his minimal clinical involvement. He'd override my medical protocols, implementing policies that increased revenue but compromised patient care. He'd criticize my surgical decisions to staff, positioning himself as the experienced voice correcting my supposedly limited judgment. Several staff members approached me privately, expressing concern about the practice dynamics. They said Robert took credit for my work constantly, that he'd told them he was the actual surgical expert and I was still learning, that he made decisions contradicting my medical judgment. They were uncomfortable with the dishonesty but felt powerless to challenge the practice owner. During those 2 years of systematic documentation, I was simultaneously and carefully building my legal case and exit strategy with the same meticulous attention to detail I applied to surgical procedures. I maintained comprehensive medical records that clearly specified me as the attending veterinarian and surgeon for every single procedure I performed. Every surgery, every examination, every treatment plan, every follow-up visit was documented with my name prominently recorded as the responsible veterinarian. This created an irrefutable paper trail proving I was the actual medical provider despite Robert's false public claims. I gathered detailed client testimonials and reviews that specifically praised my surgical skills, my compassionate bedside manner, my thorough explanations of medical conditions and treatment options, and my personal follow-up care. These testimonials often mentioned me by name, making clear that clients viewed me as their veterinarian and valued my specific care. I saved emails and text messages from clients thanking me personally for saving their pets' lives or providing excellent care during emergencies. I documented every instance I could identify of Robert falsely claiming to have performed surgeries I'd done. I kept notes about conversations I'd overheard where he told clients he'd performed procedures. I saved the news segment and other media coverage where he misrepresented his role. I created a comprehensive timeline of his credit theft with dates, specific claims he'd made, and evidence proving the truth. The documentation was thorough and systematic. I also began carefully building relationships with clients independent of the practice infrastructure Robert controlled, ensuring they understood I was their actual veterinarian and creating personal loyalty that would transfer if I left. I'd provide my personal cell phone number for after-hours emergencies, making myself available directly rather than routing through the practice's answering service. I'd follow up personally on surgical cases with phone calls checking on recovery, showing attentive care that went beyond basic requirements. I'd send handwritten notes after particularly complex cases, reinforcing personal relationships. These efforts created strong client loyalty and direct relationships. Clients knew they could reach me directly, that I personally cared about their pet's welfare, that I was the veterinarian actually providing their medical care regardless of who owned the practice building. This personal connection would prove crucial during my transition to independence. I consulted extensively with business attorneys who specialized in partnership disputes and practice ownership conflicts, investing substantial personal funds in legal counsel to ensure my rights were protected and my exit strategy was sound. The attorneys reviewed our partnership operating agreement carefully, analyzing the terms and identifying areas where Robert had violated the agreement's provisions. They discovered that Robert had systematically violated multiple partnership agreement terms. He'd taken profit distributions exceeding what was specified without partner approval. He'd made major business decisions like hiring key staff and expanding services without the joint consultation required by our agreement. He'd committed practice funds to marketing campaigns and facility upgrades exceeding the authority limits established in our agreement. Each violation strengthened my legal position for forcing partnership dissolution. The attorneys also carefully analyzed the practice's financial records, working with a forensic accountant I'd hired to trace capital contributions and document ownership claims. This analysis revealed that contrary to Robert's repeated claims about contributing majority capital to build the practice, I had actually contributed more total capital than he had. Robert had invested less personal money than claimed, instead leveraging early practice revenues and my initial contributions to fund facility development while taking credit for the investment. This financial analysis was crucial for establishing true ownership percentages and practice valuation. When I presented this evidence, Robert's claims about deserving larger ownership stake because of superior capital contribution would collapse. The numbers proved the opposite of what he'd been claiming. The attorneys developed comprehensive legal strategy for partnership dissolution, identifying the strongest grounds for action and preparing the documentation that would protect my interests. We had solid basis for dissolution based on Robert's agreement violations, his fraud in misrepresenting his role to clients, and his systematic credit theft that damaged my professional reputation. We prepared dissolution documents that would give me option to buy out Robert's interest at fair value or force practice sale with proceeds distributed according to actual ownership percentages. I also spent those 2 years quietly building alternative options and exit paths that would give me leverage and security. I began building relationships with clients independent of the practice, ensuring they understood I was their veterinarian. I secured commitments from 15 major clients who said explicitly they'd follow me to any new practice I opened. These were high-value clients with multiple pets requiring ongoing care and who'd expressed deep loyalty to me personally, representing significant recurring revenue. Several of these clients told me directly they'd been uncomfortable with Robert's claims about performing surgeries, saying they'd suspected he wasn't being truthful but hadn't known how to address it without creating conflict. Their validation that other people had recognized Robert's fraud was important confirmation my perceptions were accurate. I also received direct offers from 2 established veterinary hospital groups in the Seattle area interested in either acquiring our practice or hiring me as their chief surgeon with equity stake. One group offered me a senior surgeon position with ownership path and the ability to bring my client relationships. The other expressed interest in buying Mitchell Chen Veterinary Hospital if I was interested in selling rather than continuing independently. These options provided alternative paths forward if partnership dissolution became complicated or contentious. After exactly 2 years of comprehensive documentation and strategic preparation, I had everything needed to leave safely and protect myself legally. I had medical records proving my clinical work. I had client testimonials and loyalty ensuring revenue continuity. I had financial evidence documenting Robert's violations and fraudulent ownership claims. I had legal counsel prepared to enforce my rights aggressively. The foundation was absolutely solid and the timing was right. I scheduled a formal meeting with Robert, explicitly framing it as a legal discussion about partnership issues. I arrived with my attorney, Patricia Morrison, who specialized in business partnership disputes. Her presence made immediately clear this was serious legal action, not casual business discussion. I also brought Drive. Lisa Wong, my former residency mentor, who'd agreed to serve as expert witness about veterinary professional standards and Robert's ethical violations. Robert arrived at the conference room we'd reserved at a neutral location, looking surprised and visibly concerned seeing my legal representation and veterinary expert present. "Sarah, what's happening? Why do we have lawyers and witnesses here for a partnership meeting?" His voice carried unusual anxiety that suggested he knew his fraud was about to be exposed. I kept my voice calm and professional despite the anger and hurt I felt. "Robert, this is a formal meeting to dissolve our partnership and address your systematic fraud. I'm presenting evidence of your violations of our partnership agreement and your fraudulent misrepresentation of your role at the hospital." I slid a thick folder across the table containing comprehensive documentation I'd prepared. "This contains evidence of 23 documented instances where you fraudulently claimed to have performed surgeries I conducted. It includes medical records proving I performed all complex surgical procedures at our hospital. It includes client testimonials specifically praising my surgical care. It includes the news segment and other media where you falsely represented yourself as the hospital's principal surgeon. It includes financial analysis proving I contributed more capital than you despite your claims of majority investment." Robert opened the folder slowly, his confident demeanor cracking as he flipped through pages of damning evidence. Medical records with my name as surgeon. Client emails thanking me personally. Financial documents showing his agreement violations. The proof was overwhelming and irrefutable. "This is completely absurd, Sarah," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We're partners. We built this practice together. You're misinterpreting normal business practices and partnership dynamics. This is going to damage everything we've created." Patricia leaned forward with professional authority. "Mr. Chen, I'm Patricia Morrison, Dr. Mitchell's attorney. The evidence documents systematic fraud, not normal partnership dynamics. Claiming to have personally performed surgeries you didn't conduct violates professional standards and constitutes fraud against clients who made medical decisions based on false information. Your financial violations of the partnership agreement are clearly documented and provide grounds for immediate dissolution." Robert looked between Patricia and me, his expression shifting from defensive to calculating. "Sarah, even if there have been some miscommunications or misunderstandings about attribution, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers and formal dissolution. We can restructure the partnership, clarify roles going forward, adjust our agreement to address your concerns." "These aren't miscommunications," I said firmly. "You systematically lied to clients about who performed their pets' surgeries. You claimed credit publicly for surgical innovations I developed. You violated our partnership agreement repeatedly. You took profit distributions you weren't entitled to. You fraudulently claimed ownership percentages you didn't earn. This isn't something to restructure. This is fraud that requires dissolution and legal remedy." Robert's expression hardened. "If you force dissolution, I'll fight you on every point. Practice valuation, ownership percentages, client relationships. I'll make this as difficult and expensive as possible. I built this facility. I created the business structure. You can't just walk away with what I created." Patricia looked completely unconcerned by the threat. "Mr. Chen, we welcome litigation if that's your preference. The evidence of your fraud is comprehensive and irrefutable. We have medical records, client testimony, financial documentation, and expert witnesses prepared to testify. Litigation will expose your systematic fraud publicly to the veterinary community and your clients. We're fully prepared for court. The question is whether you are." The color drained from Robert's face as he understood the full implications. Public exposure of his fraud would destroy whatever professional reputation he'd built on lies. Clients would learn he'd lied about performing surgeries on their beloved pets. The veterinary community would know he'd fraudulently claimed expertise he didn't possess. His career would be finished. "What do you want?" he asked quietly, his aggressive bluster completely deflated. I laid out my terms clearly and firmly. I want immediate partnership dissolution. I want accurate accounting of all practice finances and capital contributions. I want the option to buy out your ownership interest at fair value based on accurate accounting, or alternatively to force practice sale with proceeds distributed according to actual ownership percentages the financial analysis has established. I want written acknowledgement that I was the medical founder and principal surgeon. I want prohibition on you making any future claims about having performed surgeries I conducted. I want non-disparagement agreement. And I want you to leave veterinary practice in Seattle. Robert initially tried to negotiate, but my attorney made clear our position was strong and we weren't compromising on core terms. His own attorney, after reviewing the evidence privately, advised him that fighting would be expensive, public, and likely unsuccessful. After hours of difficult negotiation, we reached settlement agreement. I would retain full ownership of the practice, buying out Robert's interest at fair valuation based on the accurate financial accounting. The valuation was significantly lower than Robert had claimed because the forensic analysis proved he'd contributed less capital than represented. Robert would receive fair compensation for legitimate business contributions he'd made to facility development, but would acknowledge in legally binding writing that I was the practice's medical founder and principal surgeon. He'd sign comprehensive non-disparagement and non-compete agreements. He'd leave Seattle's veterinary market entirely. Robert signed the dissolution agreement with visible reluctance, his hand shaking slightly as he acknowledged the truth he'd been hiding for 2 years. The signature represented complete collapse of the fraud he'd maintained, forcing him to admit in legal documents that I'd built the practice's medical foundation while he'd stolen credit. Within 1 week, I'd assumed sole ownership of what I renamed Sarah Mitchell Veterinary Hospital. I announced the transition to clients through personalized letters explaining the partnership had dissolved and I was continuing the practice as sole owner. The response was overwhelmingly positive and supportive. Clients wrote back saying they'd worked with me for medical care anyway and were relieved I'd be continuing. Several mentioned they'd always known Robert was misrepresenting his role and were glad the truth was finally public. Staff universally supported the transition, telling me privately they'd known Robert was lying about his surgical work and were relieved to work under honest leadership going forward. Several said they'd considered leaving due to ethical discomfort with his fraud but had stayed because they valued my medical excellence and didn't want to abandon the patients. Their loyalty and support during the transition was deeply meaningful. The practice flourished under sole ownership in ways that exceeded even optimistic projections. Without Robert's interference and mismanagement, I implemented medical protocols based purely on optimal patient welfare rather than profit maximization. I hired additional skilled veterinary surgeons, building a true specialty surgical referral hospital that other veterinarians throughout the region sent their most complex cases to. Client referrals increased dramatically as our reputation for surgical excellence spread through the professional and client communities. Revenue grew substantially, far exceeding what the practice had generated under the troubled partnership. Robert attempted to open a competing veterinary practice in a nearby suburb, but the venture failed quickly and spectacularly. Once clients learned through community gossip that he'd been lying about his surgical skills and claiming credit for work I'd performed, his credibility collapsed entirely. No one wanted to bring their beloved pets to a veterinarian who'd built his reputation on lies. The Seattle veterinary community learned about his fraud through professional networks and social circles. No reputable veterinary surgeons would agree to work with him given his exposed history of credit theft and professional dishonesty. His attempted independent practice closed within 6 months, and Robert left Seattle entirely in professional disgrace. 5 years after the partnership dissolution, Sarah Mitchell Veterinary Hospital was recognized as one of the premier veterinary surgical centers in the entire Pacific Northwest region. I'd personally trained numerous surgical residents through academic affiliations I'd established with veterinary schools. I'd published additional research on surgical techniques in peer-reviewed veterinary journals. I spoke regularly at professional conferences about surgical innovations and mentorship. The professional recognition and respect I deserved finally arrived with completely proper attribution to the veterinarian who'd actually earned it through years of training, skill development, and dedicated clinical work. I also began significant advocacy work helping other veterinarians, particularly women veterinarians and early career doctors, protect themselves from exploitative partnerships and fraudulent credit theft. I developed comprehensive educational resources about partnership agreements, practice valuation, proper documentation of clinical work, and recognizing warning signs of professional exploitation. I spoke at veterinary conferences and schools about my experience, teaching emerging veterinarians about protecting themselves legally and professionally from the kinds of fraud I'd experienced. 7 years later, I received the Excellence in Veterinary Surgery Award from the American College of Veterinary Surgeons, recognizing both my surgical innovations and contributions to the profession through mentorship and advocacy for professional integrity. During my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of proper attribution, the damage caused by credit theft, and the responsibility established veterinarians have to mentor and protect junior colleagues. The standing ovation suggested my message resonated deeply with an audience that understood these challenges. Today, Sarah Mitchell Veterinary Hospital operates with a talented team of board-certified surgeons, serving thousands of animal patients annually and providing training for the next generation of veterinary specialists. My surgical work has saved countless animals' lives and improved quality of life for many more, all with proper attribution to the veterinarian who actually provided the care. I've built exactly the career and practice I envisioned through surgical excellence, compassionate patient care, and absolute professional integrity. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome is knowing I've helped other veterinarians avoid similar exploitation. Professional veterinary organizations now emphasize partnership protection and proper documentation in their career guidance. Young veterinarians have better resources and awareness than existed when I started independent practice. The systemic changes create lasting positive impact beyond my individual success. That's the ultimate outcome when systematic fraud meets someone skilled enough to succeed independently, patient enough to document everything comprehensively, and committed enough to expose the truth and seek justice. Robert Chen destroyed his veterinary career through his own dishonesty and credit theft. I built mine on the surgical work I actually performed, the client relationships I genuinely earned, and the professional integrity I maintained even when exploitation made that difficult. Justice served.